Yeah. Hi, this is Dr. Johansson, and I am going to give you your first online video for general biology. This course is going to be a combination of online lectures and in-class lectures and in-class activities. The reason I am making some online videos is so that we have more time in class for discussion and help and things like that. So my goal is to have videos that are more of some of the fundamental basics online, and then the harder concepts we'll talk about in class. There are always PowerPoints to go along with each lecture, so you can print them out or you can have them on and take notes on them, and I do that both for the online and the in-class lectures. Something else that's really important for this class is the learning outcomes. So every chapter will have a list of learning outcomes. What it says up here is really important. It says pay attention to the verb. Describe, explain, construct, distinguish. So I'm not asking you to memorize the 7 major characteristics of living organisms. I'm going to ask you to explain them. I'm going to ask you to maybe have a story problem and understand where these 7 major characteristics come in, or I might give you a description and you have to identify the 7 major characteristics. So this class isn't about memorizing. Yes, you have to memorize a lot of vocabulary because there's a lot of vocabulary in biology, but you also have to do what we call higher order thinking, like describe and identify, and not just regurgitate definitions. The other thing I want you to know is I try to cover most of the learning outcomes in class or in online lectures, and I will say sometimes I call these learning objectives, same thing. But even if I don't cover them, you are responsible for everything that is on that learning outcomes sheet. Okay, so make sure you go through these learning outcomes. So we're going to start off today, chapter 1, and we're going to talk about these 7 major characteristics of living organisms. And this is an image from your book. And sometimes I use figures from your book. Sometimes I use outside figures. I like to let students analyze figures they might not have seen before. It's another way to test your understanding. So the 7 properties of life are basically, and the key one is that cells are the simplest unit of life. So anything that's living is made up of a cell. Okay? And we're going to talk about in this class what is inside a cell, what makes it a cell, how do cells work, but cells are the basic unit of life. In addition, living organisms use energy. Okay. So we will talk in this class about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, specific types of energy. We'll talk a little bit about enzymes, which use energy to make chemical reactions happen. But all living organisms use energy. Think of metabolism. Okay. Living organisms interact with their environment, so they can respond to changes, right? We have it kind of easy because a lot of times we can respond to the environment with clothing or shelter. Right? But things like lizards have to interact with their environment by heating things up, not heating things up, sorry, going and sitting on a hot rock if they're cold, or going into shade. And in this illustration, because plants are dependent on sunlight for growth, they're going to bend or grow towards the light. So living organisms interact with their environment. Living organisms maintain homeostasis, which means living organisms, all the way to the cell level, are trying to maintain a very stable environment. Right? So when you get into cell biology, you'll learn about regulation of ion movement and electrical currents, and the movement of different molecules in and out of the cell. That's a type of homeostasis. It wants to keep things stable, and when we can't maintain homeostasis, that results in disease. So homeostasis is our normal internal conditions, our order, and when we lose the ability to maintain homeostasis, we're in a disease state. Living organisms grow and develop. Right? So this is kind of sometimes a challenging one when you think about single-celled organisms, because they don't necessarily change that much or develop, but definitely you can understand from baby turtle to mama papa turtle, right? This baby is growing, it's going to get bigger, it's going to develop. So it started out as an egg and sperm union, and it developed into having legs and a head and a brain and a shell. And even at the singular or at the single cell level, those organisms are growing and developing, just not as easy to think about as multicellular organisms. Excuse me. The sixth property of life is genetic material. Okay. And so for all living organisms, and I apologize, I don't know why my pen does that, but you'll see it do it. For all living organisms, that's DNA. In your DNA, and we'll learn a lot about DNA this semester, are the instructions for your cell to interact with the environment and use energy and maintain homeostasis and grow and develop. So the genetic material, the blueprint for reproduction, for making more organisms, is DNA. And then finally, a very important property of life is that populations of organisms evolve or change. So another word for evolve is change over time. So you might think of adaptation. Organisms with certain advantages reproduce more, they pass on their genetic information to the next generation. But if you don't evolve with a changing environment, you're probably going to die out. So, 7 properties of life, understand what they are, be able to apply them. For instance, is yogurt alive? So, yogurt with active cultures has bacteria. And bacteria are cells. Right? But the rest of the yogurt, which is the milk and the other pectin and vitamin D and that stuff, right? That's not alive. So I might give you something and you have to determine if it's alive or not. And you basically go through those 7 characteristics. So does it have cells? Well, parts of yogurt does. Does it use energy? Well, the bacteria are replicating if they're live, active cultures. So, yeah. Does yogurt interact with its environment? That's kind of a hard one, right? So, the bacteria sure do, because if they run out of food, they're going to die, right? And then they're going to actually, they might produce more acidic byproducts and make your yogurt taste nasty. Homeostasis. Does the yogurt maintain homeostasis? Grow and develop. And so what I'm looking for when you go through and answer a question, is yogurt alive, is I'm asking you to give me the different characteristics and then explain, justify why you think that shows that yogurt is alive or not. Because there are many characteristics of life that can be applied to non-living organisms. Okay. So even a dead leaf will interact with its environment and will get blown away by the wind, right? Chemicals can grow. You can grow crystals. So I want you to think about these and be able to apply the 7 properties of life in different scenarios. All right, so how is life organized? I guess there should be a question mark here. Oops. Okay. So I like this picture because it shows you from small to large. The organization of life. So we're going to spend time talking about atoms and molecules and macromolecules, and you can kind of follow this as a flow chart. And we're going to get into cells, and that's where we really stop in General Biology 1. Okay. We will talk about this organization as we learn about the big level of cells. We don't get into tissues and organs. That's really anatomy and physiology classes. The organism, population, community, ecosystem, you'll be looking at that in GB2, in ecology, in evolution. If you really find GB1 fascinating, then take cell biology, because that's where we look at cells in depth. But in this class, we're going to focus on the molecules, okay, and we're going to focus on how they work in a cell. Okay, so chapters 2 and 3 are the chemical basis of life. Okay, so we're going to learn about how we form molecules and then how these macromolecules work in our cell. And there's really only 4 types: amino acids, which are proteins; nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA; sugars, starch, carbohydrates, and fats. And then we'll start to connect those as to where they fit into a cell. So chapter 4 is about the parts of a cell and how these macromolecules function to make these working units. We'll talk about that animals requiring or using energy. We're going to talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis and enzymes. Okay. We're going to talk about reproduction. Okay. So here is a little bit of genetics. So here are cells reproducing by mitosis. We're going to learn about DNA replication. So you have to make more DNA in order to be able to divide your cells and make multiple cells or multiple cellular organisms. We're going to talk about the processes of transcription and translation, which is getting your genetic material from DNA to a functional unit of protein or RNA. And we'll talk about genetics. We'll talk about meiosis, how we form these haploid cells that can come together with other haploid cells and form a new organism. We talk about evolution a little bit, in that I want you to understand that changes in your DNA that are passed on to the next generation are going to make that generation a little bit different. That's evolution. That's that change. Okay. So we'll talk about genetics in this class as well. And all of this knowledge and understanding that we have is really based on the scientific method. So what I want you to understand about the scientific method is that in general, you first have to observe something. Right? You ask a question, you do some background research. your car won't start. You try to figure out why. So you observe something and then you make a prediction, which in science is called a hypothesis. And lots of times, or you may have learned the if, then, because of a hypothesis. And this formal format just helps you think about how I'm going to word my prediction, right? If I study a little bit every night, then I should earn an A or B in this class because I'm learning the material and not trying to cram it, right? So we all do the scientific method every day. We just don't think about it so formally. And what we always do too is we test it. Experiments. Right? So, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, you are excited about being fall semester, you're studying regularly, you're getting great grades, and then you come to chapter 8 and 6 and 7 and life's getting in the way, you got to do some chemistry, you got some other classes, you got a new significant other, your grades go down, right? So you're really not trying to experiment, but if you looked back on it, you are experimenting and testing that prediction, right? Because now you're not doing your if I study so much. And you get the grade at the end of the semester, and hopefully you evaluate, draw conclusions, say, yes, I need to get rid of all the distractions out of my life and just totally focus on biology and chemistry and whatever else you're taking, or, hey, I managed it all right, right? And you repeat. I mean, that's what scientists do. Research over and over and over again. So scientific method you're probably pretty familiar with. What I want you to also know is when we talk about these different variables. So we talk about control or constant variables, independent and dependent variables. So the control or the constant is what you keep the same. So if you're testing the hypothesis that if you study a little bit every night, you'll get a better grade in the class, right? Well, you are a control or a constant, right? You are the same throughout the experiment. Me, the teacher's the same. Types of homework are the same. What you're changing is the independent variable. Right? So that would be the number of hours you're studying. And what you're measuring is the dependent variable, your grade. Right? So let's look at an example really quick. Marge Simpson decided to start a new garden. She heard that plants compete for space and decided to test this idea. She bought a mixture of flower seeds and some potting soil. And she put the same amount of soil into 5 cups, and then she planted 2, 4, 8, 16 seeds, and in the last cup, 32. After 25 days, she determined which plants looked the healthiest. So what was the independent variable, the thing that she changed? It was the number of seeds, right? That's what's different in each cup. Dependent variable, what was she measuring? Well, she was measuring the health of the plants. And that, honestly, she'd have to get more specific. Was she measuring how much they grew, or how many leaves they had, or how tall they were, things like that. But from this example, that's what she was measuring. And the controlled variables, or the constants, were things like We assume all the plastic cups were the same, and she had the same amount of soil, and it was the same number of days, and we'll hope that she gave them the same amount of water and the same amount of light, right? Everything that was kept the same. And so her hypothesis, an easy way to remember how to write this is, if you put the independent variable, then you put the dependent variable, and the because is really from your background research, right? So if I plant more seeds in a cup, then they will decrease in health because they will compete for space, right? So not too hard at all. This I want to talk about for a second. Control group, okay? A control group is when you are comparing groups that are the same except for the independent variable. And we don't always have control groups. Oops. Okay, so let's go here. Does she have a control group? No. Okay. She doesn't know which one, is going to grow the best. She hasn't done that kind of experiment. We see control groups in a lot of human trials. So say you're going to test out, does a drug help with high blood pressure? So you would have a group without the medicine and an experimental group with the medicine, right? And so you're comparing the experiment with the control. So the control doesn't get the independent variable and the experimental group does. So I just want you to understand this big difference between control variables and a control group. Finally, one word on graphing data, though we're not going to do that this much. I'm sure you're going to do it in lab. And so as you're thinking about these dependent and independent variables, understand that the dependent variable always goes on the y-axis. The thing that you are measuring. And your independent variable always goes on the x-axis. The thing that you are changing, right? So revenue versus number of cars. We're going to change the number of cars and we're going to plot, we're going to measure how much money we make, right? The revenue, the amount of money we make, depends on the number of cars. Same with down here. I know it's hard to read. Thickness of rings for a tree, trees years. Okay, we're going to look at trees at these different number of years and we're going to measure how thick the rings are. So the thickness of the rings depends on how old the tree is. So if you look at this graph, which is the dependent variable and which is the independent variable? The independent variable, the thing we're manipulating, is the speed, right? We can make cars drive at different speeds. What we're measuring, the dependent variable, is the cost of a speeding ticket, right? Unfortunately for you, you can't control that, right? Unless you don't speed, okay? So, independent on the bottom, dependent up the sides. All right, so you've made it through your first chapter. What I suggest you do is you read the text, you work through the learning outcomes, you always watch all videos I post, you come to class and you get to love biology. All right, Thanks, guys. Now I have to figure out how to turn off my recording.